Welcome, everyone. Oh, look at that, latecomer. Good. Lovely for all of you to be here and to listen to myself talk with Lori Waxman. What I'll do is, well, most of the presentation is going to be, I suppose, a chat between Lori and myself. But for any one of you, feel free to jump in if you have a question that needs to be answered. And you can do this by simply starting to talk. But also, if you want to be maybe a bit nicer, you can raise your hand physically, or you can use the raise hand feature in Microsoft Teams. You can also use the chat. Well, unless we're talking and you really have something to write down, use the chat. Otherwise, raise your hand and throw yourself in there. So we are joined today by Lori Waxman, who is originally from Montreal, Canada, soon to be the 51st states of the United States, 51st state of the United States. Yeah, I can't help it, man. It's what the future will bring. But she lives in Chicago. She's already in the United States, and there she teaches at the School of the Art Institute, if I'm not mistaken. And she has a PhD in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts in New York and has been the Chicago Tribune's primary art critic since 2009. She also is a monthly columnist for Hyperallergic since 2022. She does, of course, many things. And one thing that's really nice, and I'm going to ask her to say a few words about this, is her 60-word-a-minute art critic performance, in which Lori writes art reviews in public and on demand for any artist who wants a review. And this project has been exhibited at Documenta 13 and received the Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant to fund a tour across the US. Lots of fun. She is the author of several books. And the one why she is with us here today is a book called Keep Walking Intently, which she wrote in 2017, I think. Where in the book she looks at the act of walking as part of the practices of the surrealists, the situationists and Fluxus. And as I said, this is why we are here now. Now, I'm going to open with a quote on walking that I pulled from the book. Maybe it's a way to ground ourselves a little bit, to think again of walking as a way to find also peace, but also to kick against the can sometimes. And that is a quote from Kierkegaard, the philosopher who lived in Copenhagen in the 1800s, in the 19th century. And the quote is this: "Above all, do not lose your desire to walk. Every day I, Kierkegaard, walk myself into a state of well-being and walk away from every illness. I have walked myself into my best thoughts, and I know of no thought so burdensome that one cannot walk away from it." So I thought it was a really lovely quote. There are plenty of great quotes in the book. I'm going to pick out another one, and that is, I think, one by Lori herself, which is, if something, and I'm paraphrasing now, if something appears to be boring, you are not looking hard enough. So the burden lies with you at all times if you're bored. Now, that's enough of me. Lori, can you say a few words about your book, Keep Walking Intently?
Sure. And thanks for the nice introduction, Babak. So the book, which was published in 2017, comes out of my PhD work. So I wrote it even before 2017. And it has maybe a little funny backstory, which is that I had been wanting to do my PhD work on wonder as an aesthetic. That was what intrigued me most if I thought about all the art that I cared about the most and that I responded to the most. It all somehow seemed to be about wonder in the world or giving you an experience of wonder, but it's a very abstract topic, wonder. You have to really enjoy reading philosophy and writing in abstract ways, and I don't. I like the concrete world. And so I went back to all of the artwork that I care about the most, and the other thing that it all seemed to have most in common was walking. So many of the practices involved walking because it is such a concrete way of engaging with the world, even if it ends up in a more abstract way. So it was all contemporary artwork, which is not something you can write a PhD about, not really, definitely not in the US, and not in 15 years ago. So I ended up writing the history of those practices, and I went back to the Surrealists, the Situationists International, and Fluxus, three really important movements from the 20th century, all of which had like radical politics of one kind or another at their heart. And they're really nice to study because they're movements. So there's a lot going on, and people write, manifestos. And all three of these movements have tons of walking art, but none of them had really been looked at quite with that specific of a focus. And I thought if I did that work, if I looked through everything on those movements, only looking for the traces of walking, I could figure something out about how walking is useful to artists and useful politically. And then I could eventually find my way back to the contemporary artists that really I care about the most, who I hope we'll get to talk about.
Yeah, I hope so too, because that was also my initial question or wonder at the start of reading of the book, and also while I was reading the book, I was wondering, what are the current descendants of these three movements in terms of walking art? But as you were saying, as you were hinting at just now, and also as you were saying in a previous conversation that we had, is that your PhD advisor said, well, you can't write about stuff that happens now. It has to be historical research. So that's why you ended up with writing about these three movements. But it was a lovely read, so that was good. But we will get to indeed the question that triggered maybe your initial thoughts, and also what I'm wondering about. But before we get there, and before I start with a few questions around the book, can you also say a few words about your 60-word-per-minute art critic project?
Sure. So this is a project that I came up with in 2005 and that I still do once or twice a year if the opportunity arises. In the simplest, sort of the standard form of the performance is I will go to a small city, like I've been to Portland, Maine, let's say. Nobody goes to Portland, Maine to check out the art scene. You go there as a tourist or you live there, but it's not like on the art map in the United States. So I went there, I set up a little desk in a place called Spaces, which is a local art gallery. And we announced to the local art community that I would be there for 3 days and I would write reviews for anybody who wanted them. You just had to make an appointment, first come, first serve. You turn up, you bring me your art. I look at it, I write a review on the spot. My computer is hooked up to a projector or a flat screen monitor so that the actual writing of the review is visible. It's public. It's transparent to anybody who's hanging out in the space because it's a performance. And then after the fact, everything gets published in a local newsweekly or newspaper, whatever they've got in that particular town. So usually it's a town where there is no art critic. There is no art criticism being published locally, even though there are artists, right? Some kind of an art scene. So it's sort of temporarily, there is an art critic who is writing about the local artists and publishing it locally. And it maybe gives the town a taste of what that's like to have that, I think, very healthy element of the art ecosystem present. And then also it's meant to just open that up to anybody. So a hobbyist can come in and have a review. Someone can bring in their 6-year-old's drawings and get a review. And, the most famous artist in town can come in and get a review. And everybody gets treated with the same amount of seriousness. And all the reviews appear in the same way and they're about the same length. And then I leave.
So it's a kind of live blogging, but it's live critiquing. When was the first time you did this?
2005,
Wow.
in a kind of like early form of it that didn't have all the elements quite worked out, but it's been pretty standard form for the last like 10 years.
Wow. And how many of these have you done?
Maybe 20.
Babak. Wow.
But
1 a year.
The Documenta one was like the mega version. I did it for 3 months straight.
Oh wow.
3 days a week.
Oh, wow.
Normally it's just 3 days and I write 30 reviews in the 3 days, 10 a day. It's very regimented. And then I leave, as I said. But it's also, it's for someone to decide like that they want a review. Why might they want a review? Why might it be useful to them? So it's trying to think about art criticism in a couple of different ways than how I normally practice it.
Are all the reviews positive, or are you truthful in your reviews?
I'm serious, but it's not like no holds barred, because it's not what's called for. It's maybe a little bit more like the attitude that you would take when you go into an artist's studio to do a studio visit, and it's meant to be somewhere in between constructive and responsive.
Mm-hmm.
A large majority of the people who participate in the project are not professional artists.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't feel like it's appropriate to use all of my professional chops in the way I would in the newspaper. If I'm writing in the newspaper and you have a show in the museum, no holds barred. Like,
yep.
I will say exactly what I think needs to be said. This is different.
Yeah, I understand. Are you familiar with the podcast, The Anthropocene Reviewed?
No.
You have to listen to it, and I also recommend it to everyone else in the call, in the meeting. It's called The Anthropocene Reviewed. I think it's Tom Green. Does that make sense? Although don't pin me down on that. The show is called The Anthropocene Reviewed, and what he does every episode is where this guy reviews something from roughly the built environment, but that's not completely true, because he also reviews a sunset, for example, and he reviews stuff, I don't know, a Coca-Cola can or something, and all the reviews are funny, but in a very insightful way, and some are incredible, really very worthwhile listening to the show. Yeah. So anyway, that's something to think about, to listen to. The Anthropocene Reviewed. Thank you. Now that was really the segue, because we're here to talk about the book, right? Although I think it's related. And actually, I was thinking of the Anthropocene Reviewed because I was wondering if you go and review art, or if you're an art critic, you could also actually go into a place and review 30 things that you encounter, like the entrance to a cafe, and the coffee in a school auditorium or something, right? The things that you encounter. No, not so much.
Well, look, I think I'm a good art critic because I've been doing this for decades, and I have a PhD in art history, so I have tons of context,
right,
that and tons of really close looking at all kinds of art that I bring to any piece of art that I encounter.
Right.
I have not been drinking coffee in the same way, and I do not know the history of preparing coffee and selling coffee and growing coffee and all of that. So yeah, I mean, I'm an opinionated person, and we could go out for coffee and I'll review it, but it's not going to have the same depth that I can provide as an art critic.
I hear you. Then again, the situationists would say, well, it's really about how the coffee makes you feel. All right, anyway. I'm going to jump to some questions on your book. I really recommend everyone to pick it up, although actually that's extremely difficult, because if you want to order the book on Amazon, it's an insane $1,600 to buy the book, which sadly, probably none of that comes to you, Lori.
You have to get, if you want to buy the book at this point, I think you have to get the ebook.
Yeah, correct. And also from the publisher. That's the only way I think you can get it at the moment. And then it's an affordable, I don't know, $8 or something, or maybe 15. But it's very worthwhile. But I'm also assuming actually that most of us are latecomer. Most of us are reasonably familiar with the context of the Surrealists, the Situationists, or the Situationists International, and Fluxus. But then again, maybe not. Do you think you can do like a 1 minute speed run through the three movements, Lori?
Yes, but I'll do it in the context of the book. So I won't give you the whole movement. I'll just give you the walking version of the movement. So the Surrealists, as I look at them, it's like 1921, starting in 1921 in Paris. So they're not even the Surrealists at that point yet. They're the proto-Surrealists, but it's when they start doing stuff in the city and thinking about moving around the city in marginal spaces. And I'm interested in them up through the 1930s, let's say. And some of the major figures are like André Breton, what else do I look at? Brassai, so Breton the writer, or Brassai the photographer. And with the surrealists, the evidence for walking, like you have to be a little bit of a detective. You have to read the books and look at how walking figures into the narratives they're telling. With Brassai, you have to know that the way he found all of his photos is that he was really peripatetic, and he spent like every night for years just walking through Paris at night before he even took up a camera in order to take pictures of the scenes that he was finding as a wanderer in nighttime Paris. So with the surrealists, you're looking for evidence in the artwork. The Situationist International, I'm interested in them also before they're the Situationists. So early Situationists are called the Lettrists, and that's like the let's say around early 1950s, all the way up until the 70s, because we look at Constant also, and he keeps going. So all through the 50s and the 60s with them, and they theorized walking in very important ways. But even then with them, we're reading the text, but also still looking for evidence, like how did walking figure importantly into these practices? And then Fluxus was this, some people say still is, very international art movement. So you have it centered in a lot of different cities throughout the world, from New York to Prague, behind the Iron Curtain, Amsterdam, Japan. And it's a group of artists who are united by George Maciunas. Every movement needs to have a leader, and they need to be someone willing to write a manifesto. And for Fluxus, maybe the key thing to think about is that they are really interested in everyday life and in like making it interesting again, like doing the things of everyday life and doing them a little differently so that they can be a little bit magical.
Thank you. One prominent contributor to Fluxus that many people who are only on the side familiar with Fluxus, one prominent artist who was a Fluxus artist was Yoko Ono. That's when I learned about this many years ago, I was pleasantly surprised. She doesn't only scream behind John Lennon, also she made art in her own right that's actually very good, in my opinion. Thanks. So a few questions that I had while reading the book, and I'm just going to throw them at you, and then we'll see where it gets us. So you started talking about the surrealists, and that's where my first question relates to, or what my first question relates to. In the section on the surrealists, you highlight how for them discovery relied on raw experiences in the less cultured periphery, and this clearly prefaces the experiences and the ideas of the Situationists, or what the Situationists sought out, perhaps less so Fluxus, but you can very clearly see the connection between the Surrealists and the Situationists there. But my question is this: with the unification of culture, with the unification of global culture, where it really doesn't matter almost whether you're in a suburb of Sao Paulo or somewhere in Chicago or somewhere almost anywhere in the global south, everyone experiences the same things. There is very little cultural periphery left. And my question then is this methodology, in your opinion, a methodology of the past? And if not, or if it's slowly, or if it is slowly becoming a methodology of the past, how can we still apply this? Where should we look for this cultural periphery?
Okay. So first of all, I think I disagree with you that it's the same everywhere, even if we have these kinds of global connections. I do not think when I'm in like a borrowed office at my school right now, and I don't think that I'm having the same direct experience of the world when I leave here and I make my way home to the neighborhood I live in, that you're having, you follow some kind of similar trajectory. We live in different places. And I think a big part of the interest I have in walking and walking art is that it puts us out in the world with real bodies in real spaces, and we don't have full control over what we're going to encounter. out in those spaces. And I think that this is crucial for being like alive and thoughtful in the world, or one of the ways we might be alive and thoughtful in the world. So maybe when we're doing this virtually, there is a lot of sameness. And maybe if we're looking at the kinds of culture that travels around globally, we're looking at a lot of sameness, but I don't think that is everything at all. Okay, but do you want me to keep going? Or you want
please.
Jump in? Okay, so I pulled together some examples of artworks, contemporary artworks that are dealing with the periphery in one way or another. So it's maybe like a sideways way of getting at your question, but I thought we should just look at what artists are doing on the periphery and what it means. So let me go ahead and share my screen.
Yes. Okay,
so the first artwork I'm showing you is the most literal one that's happening on a periphery. So it's Chinese performance artist named He Yong Chang, and for like, I don't know, I think 7 months or 10 months in between 2006 and 2007, he did this piece in England. He went to a beach in the northeast of England, I think. He found a nice big 3.5 kilogram stone. He picked it up and he walked it entirely around Britain, following the coastline, more or less. Yeah, it's absurd. It's ridiculous. It took him many, many months. You can see some of the imagery that was generated from the tour of him walking around with the rock. That was his constant companion. He was followed by a crew, like a small camera crew. So that's where you get the image. That's where you get video that was produced from it and paintings that were produced from it. But what's key also is that he brought the rock all the way back to the exact spot he took it from, and he put it back down, and then the piece was over. Okay, so like he's not walking through he's walking through a city if it happens to be on the edge of England. He's doing nothing of any purpose whatsoever. And that's actually one of the ways he's talked about it, is he's really interested in being purposeless today when there's so much pressure to be productive in a very capitalist mode, whether you're inside China or in other parts of the world. And so he did an extremely ridiculous, impractical thing, and he did it vigorously with a lot of care. And I have no idea what experiences he or the rock absorbed on this tour. But they, for me, are doing something peripheral and in a peripheral place. Mm-hmm. And presenting it to us in a way where we get to think about those places and those actions. Okay, next example. Different kind of periphery. So this is like classic margins. This is a piece by Dennis Adams and Laurent Malone. What they did was, so there are these two guys, are both one of them's a photographer, one of them's a conceptual artist. They took one camera and they walked from Manhattan to JFK Airport. So that's, it took 11 hours. If you've ever been in New York, you don't do this walk. This is good. You take a taxi from JFK to get to Manhattan, and you don't have any clue what's in between one and the other. They're all kinds of, marginal neighborhoods where people live and often don't even go to Manhattan and don't go to JFK because they're not leaving on a flight anywhere. And what they did in this piece was they took one camera, they walked as straight a path, more or less, as they could through these marginal areas of New York. And every time one of them saw something that he wanted to take a picture of, they stopped, he took a picture, and then the other one took a picture in the exact opposite direction. So that's why they're back to back in that documentary image there in the bottom left corner. So the way that the work is presented is through all these pairs of photographs in this really huge book. The spine of the book explains what they did. But you have two people who, through a really simple gesture and through walking, are paying attention to the margins. Yeah. right? And they're not just paying attention to the margins in a like, oh, I found an interesting thing here. Look at this graffiti or whatever, or this weird trash. But they're also doing this random assignment of taking the photo in the exact opposite direction. So whatever else is there, the inside and the outside of the frame. So again, I think there's like more than just a classic kind of marginal being paid attention to.
Yeah, it's also what they're then doing with the photo that's the reverse, shot in the reverse direction of where the first photo is shot in. That's like the periphery of the periphery.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. I'm reminded of two things when you give this example. First is that I think Will Self also did something like this, but I don't remember which airport he walked from.
Yes, JFK
and
also.
Also JFK. And to be honest, I do this regularly because I hate public transport from airports. And if I can walk from airports, I do it. It's much more interesting. Exactly because you walk through this periphery that no one ever gets to see. So that's one. And the other is an example that you also mentioned in your book, which was Willem de Ridder in 1973, who picked up, and made a note of this, he picked up William Levy from an airport in LA and gave him instructions on how to get to the place he was staying at, and he had to walk from the airport, or he picked him up and then dropped him off somewhere, and then he had to walk the rest of the way. Anyway, go on. You have got more examples.
Okay. So the two that we just looked at, these are like classic periphery, right? Periphery of England, periphery, marginal spaces in New York. But I was thinking that periphery can have different meanings here. So periphery can be like a space in a way that we acknowledge, but there's also political peripheries, there's periphery, like racial periphery. If we're thinking about what's ignored, right? What is what we think is what is undervalued, what is invisible. So the next couple of pieces I picked out are kind of combining this. So there's both an attention, there's a walking happening in recognizably peripheral places. Like this is a Francis Alice piece that he did following the Green Line in Jerusalem, which is the border, ostensible border between the Jewish and the Arab spaces. It's based on a map from a war. It's not actually a green line in space, but he makes a green line in space by dripping green paint. So this is a borderland. Borders are very peripheral spaces, but the project is very interested in actualizing, making visible like marginal politics, like thinking about what is this space and who is living on either side of it, and is it a real space, and where does the line go, and what is the ground that the line is going on. So I think it's a way of engaging here with both peripheral space and also like peripheral people. So there's another piece a bit like this by Emily Jassir, same part of the world, where she's recording this journey that she had to do back and forth when she was living in Bethlehem and teaching at a university that is on the other side of a checkpoint. And it's such a miserable walk that, like, it's her commute and it's miserable. And she's not the only one having to do it. And so it's this incredibly marginal space and these marginal lives that an artist is using their walking body and the medium of their art making, so recording devices and whatnot, and then the installation way that she presents it, in order to get us to think about what is happening in this peripheral place with these people we ignore and these lives that are so devalued.
Yeah, and it's so extremely topical for particularly now, of course, in relation to Gaza and the West Bank, how the extent to which these people are ignored by the vast majority of the world, it's insane. It's insane. And these are, I don't know, this piece is from 2002, and Alice's piece is from 2005, if I remember correctly, 2004.
2004.
Yeah. So when the situation was so vastly different from what it is now. Yeah. Okay, so that's good. So there's still periphery. But these are quite extreme examples, right? Two of these examples are based in Palestine. Or
yes,
Israel,
I mean, I have like a really nice example if you want. That's a lot friendlier.
No, I really like this, but so I do want to see the nicer one as well. But the periphery, of course, that the surrealists and the situationists were looking for was in Paris, right? So I'll get to my next question on that. But this is very far from Paris. But show us.
This is very far from Paris. Yes.
So do show us a nice example.
Okay. So we'll skip that one here. This is a local ecologist artist. She calls herself a radical ecologist named Nancy Clem. And for about 20 years now, maybe more, she's been running urban foraging walks. So she's an interesting person because as an artist, because she really works as an ecologist, but so much of what she's wanted to do as an ecologist, like in terms of building design and permaculture, nobody would let her do for so long. So she did it as artworks, because you can do whatever you want in the art world long before it gets accepted outside the art world as a real thing. So yeah, she used to run these tours. I've been on a couple of them. You can see a photo of one here. They would take place in Chicago, so she's right by the side of the highway there, and she's taking people through, the parks, but also like all these forgotten spaces that are in between, that are green spaces that have all kinds of wild things growing in them. And she would teach us like what was what and what was edible and what told us about the plant soil and all kinds of other really interesting things that she's aware of as an ecologist. And these are very marginal spaces in our cities, right? These places where like nature and culture are kind of like this, right? They're like twisting around each other. And so for her, like they're these really important spaces to pay attention to that we mostly ignore, even though it's right there. You drive past.
They're right next to us. Yeah. Did you end up making a meal with the products that you foraged?
Yes, I still do. There's a I can't remember everything. I can't recognize everything that she taught me about, but there are some things that are very easy to find, like lamb's quarters. It's like it's a kind of wild spinach. It grows in the alleyways here.
Oh, interesting. I love spinach. Okay, I'll have to look for it. Thank you. I'm going to move to a second question. Although I love hearing about these pieces. Of course, I knew Alice's piece, and I'd heard of the other one set in Israel or Palestine, but the others I did not know. So that's really nice. Now to Paris, the surrealists and the situationists specifically were pretty big on exploring Paris. So what I've I suppose wondered for a very long time was whether there is something particular about Paris that made it such a fertile ground for these two movements. And you give two reasons in the book as why Paris was such a good space for both movements. And I think you paraphrased or you literally quoted what they themselves were saying. One was that Paris was full of failed scenarios in the city. I believe that came from the surrealists, if I remember correctly. But also, this I think related to the situationists, but it was that the following: that the street has long had a privileged place in French popular culture as a site that unites the quotidian and the festive, and is opposed to the allegedly stifling, pompous, and enclosed world of high culture. So these are very appropriate descriptions of Paris and why this could then work for the surrealists and the situationists to explore the periphery in Paris itself. But you also bring up a character called Thomas de Quincey, who lived mostly in the beginning of the 19th century, who de Boer saw as a kind of a precursor to members of his situationist movement. But Quincey was based in London and not in Paris, where Quincey, that is, walked plenty of dérives while under the heavy influence not of alcohol, as was the case for most, and hashish maybe, as was the case for most of the situationists, but under the influence of opium. So while walking through the city, while being highly attuned to the effects of the city simultaneously, which is of course prefacing the concept of synchronicity. So yeah, my question is Paris unique? And if not, then what is it that we need to look for to have similar experiences elsewhere?
Okay, so one thing is to say, no, Paris is not the only where you can find great walking art. But there are reasons why it's such a hub in the 20th century. And I think two more reasons are, in addition to the ones that you just gave us, is that it's both a great walking city, and we can explain what the facts of that are, and it's a great art city. And so if you are pushing against, there's a lot to push against, and and you're already walking. And this was true with Fluxus too. So not with Paris specifically, but like Michunas at some point wrote to somebody and said like they were having such a great reception I think they were in Nice. Like people were really responding, often very negatively, but responding to what they were doing because everybody knew what high culture was supposed to look like. In New York, which was one of their other bases, people were like, whatever, anything goes. And so if you're interested in finding the edge and making culture on the edge, you need things to push up against, and you need it to be recognizable. So Paris.
So are you then saying with this that New York is a worse place for this than Paris or Nice?
At the point in time when Fluxus is at its height, it's just different. It's really because the Fluxus was doing work in Europe and in New York, they could compare the responses that they were getting to the work they would do on the street in particular. And in the street in New York, nobody blinked an eye. All kinds of crazy things happen on the street in New York. So fine, you can do anything. But if you're interested in having people pay attention, it is harder in New York than it is in a place where, no, everybody is very well behaved on the street. There's decorum, there's bourgeoisie, and we know where the high art is supposed to be in the theaters and in the museums.
Yeah. I remember it's around 25 years ago, first or second time I was in New York, which was, the first was just before 9/11, the second was just after 9/11. And I don't remember on which visit this was, but I remember seeing the guy in New York on the street with the cat on his head. I don't know if you know this guy. This used to be quite a well-known individual. He walked around with a cat on his head, and if you wanted a photo of it, you needed to pay the guy. And of course, I was like, "Oh my God, I'm seeing the guy with the cat on his head. This is real." The guy walked around with the cat on his head, and no one batted an eye. No one on the street was like, "Oh yeah." They were like, "Yeah, it's the guy with the cat on his head." Of course, yeah, that was New York. But do you do this in anywhere else almost, and people will respond differently. Then again, if he walks the same route every day, those who walk that route as well will be very used to the guy. But case in point, I totally understand what you're saying. I forget the guy's name, who was Fluxus artist who was based in Prague, who, because he was doing things that were out of the ordinary, always would draw the attention of the authorities, because in totalitarian regimes, everything that is not standardized and in accordance to the will of those who are wanting to control you will be noticed and might get you arrested, jailed, deported. Yeah.
You read my mind. That's like the third piece of the puzzle. If we look at, three different city examples. So it was Milan Knizak, who you're thinking of, and the Actual group. And yes, they even had a piece where they said or they had a manifesto where they just said to people, like, just do something in your daily life a little bit different. And that in and of itself is this radical move in communist Prague. I mean, they did crazy things, but they also would time them so that the evidence was disappeared by the garbage truck, so they wouldn't get in trouble.
Yeah. That's a beautiful piece. You mentioned it in your book, where they rearranged trash on the streets into tableaus of trash, but just before the garbage truck would arrive and pick up the trash. So the ephemerality was part of the performance, but also allowed them to be able to deny that they did anything afterwards, right? Because at the time, no one walked around with cell phones recording everything. So that's a very nice example. Of course, pushing against the ordinary is also something that's very easy in a city like Jerusalem or almost anywhere in Israel. Everything gets attention, right? Even if you look different, you don't have to do anything. You just have to look different, and you will get attention. Of course, this applies to many other places as well. But yeah, okay. So no, you're saying it's not unique to Paris, but what matters is that you push against the ordinary.
Well, and that, there are reasons why what happened in Paris, but because there is a sort of confluence of factors. And we didn't even talk about, what a great city it is to walk in. Like, that is a big part of it. So, it's very boring to walk in Chicago, where I live. It's a gridded city, and it's a big city. Like, it's impossible to get lost. You would have to not understand the grid. And I understand it very well. It's like burned in my brain. It's really hard to get lost in New York also, if you're in the central part of the city. It's also a grid, but it's such a dense grid that it's exciting. Paris is amazing. You have to try very hard not to get lost in Paris, because yes, there's the Grand Boulevard, but in between them are these warrens of little medieval streets. It's a terrific city for wandering. It's sort of inspired, you understand how the Situationists existed there and the Surrealists existed there, and how there is something very copacetic between the ideas they came up with and the places that they were walking.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. I should not say though. And there are many other European cities, I think, in which this could also, where people could have similar experiences. One city that I used to be in love with, and I still really like it, but in many ways can be compared to Paris, is Budapest, I think, but also Prague is one of those cities. And also actually a few of the smaller Eastern European cities that have been much less touched by capitalist development after the Second World War. If you go to Ljubljana maybe, or Bratislava, Krakow maybe as well. And maybe even more so now, because they're more experimental also, artists in these places than maybe there are in the centers of high culture, maybe. But that's great, because that segue, my mentioning of the word capitalist, brings me to my next question. And that is, you mentioned a surrealist mantra that capitalism can be resisted, not just by exposing these outmoded objects and places, that is, things that fall by the wayside of progress, but by re-enchanting them. I think that's a fascinating insight. How would you say, how do you think can we apply this today? What can we re-enchant, and how is that going to serve us?
Okay, so let me pop forward here. So I was really trying to think about this in terms of it being an anti-capitalist gesture, because there's all kinds of re-enchantment of outmoded things throughout culture that are totally capitalist. I mean, you can upcycle anything and sell it, or we can look at Robert Rauschenberg and the Combines. I mean, none of that is anti-capitalist now anyway. So I was thinking still about examples of artists who I know are doing work in ways that just don't fit a capitalist model. So there's the previous example I gave you of Nancy Clem and the urban foraging. And it's worth noting that she doesn't charge for those. It's a barter system. So you bring her something in order to participate in one of the tours. There is somewhat similarly, there's a collective in Los Angeles called the Fallen Fruit Collective that has been running these public fruit tours since 2004. And what they do is they will go to a neighborhood and they map all the fruit trees in the neighborhood that where the branches are extending from private property over into public property, or if they're just on public property. So it's an idea of the commons, which has particular existence in US legal code, and it would be different in other countries. But the idea here is, like, in the legal code, it says that fruit that grows on over common land, common fruit, anybody can pick it. And you also have this situation in places like Los Angeles where people have fruit trees and they don't pick the fruit, and it falls and it rots, and you get all kinds of urban animals coming to your lawn, and people don't actually don't want it. So these groups that Fall on Fruit organizes, they go out sometimes and they do fruit picking, and they meet the people who own the property. They'll often go out like in the evening so that people are home, so that there is an engagement as opposed to like it being perceived as thievery. And the maps that they draw up are also freely distributed. So you can go online and find the PDF of all kinds of places and the fruit maps. So it's trying to think about using an art piece as a way of thinking about the commons. Yeah.
I'm reminded with your example of how I might get the period wrong, but I'm thinking like the late Middle Ages in the UK, as they moved out of the feudal system, or maybe that was a little bit earlier, but where specifically fruit trees that people could eat the fruit from were not used for planting to demarcate borders, because it would allow people to not have to work. They could just pick the fruits and lie on the side of the road and enjoy them. Instead, if they could not pick fruits for free, they had to work to survive. So this is also, in that sense, a very anti-capitalist project. Very nice. I'm also reminded of something else. I'm talking about re-enchantment. One thing, as you say, re-enchantment can very well be a capitalist mode or action. Case in point being also vinyl. Vinyl is given re-enchantment, but it's sold at huge prices. It's not anti-capitalist at all. It's okay. Do you have another wonderful example of re-enchanting?
Yes, I have a different example. So this is the artist Richard Wentworth, the British artist, who I think is really well known as a sculptor in England. But I love this photo project that he's been doing since 1974 called Making Do and Getting By. And there's thousands and thousands of photos. But basically, he's a walker. He walks around a lot, and he has the eyeballs of a sculptor. So he is always looking for how objects in the environment are being misused, often in quite clever ways, but like a boot is not a doorstop, right? So somebody took that boot and needed it to do something else, and actually made this kind of amazing transformation by shoving it under a door, or a coffee cup being used to prop up a
window,
so he notices two things. One is objects being used against their intentions, and the other is patterns in the environment. So like the eye of a graphic artist. So the example in the bottom left corner is one of those. Well, it's both actually. So it's both like finding this geometric shape in the environment and finding it repeated, but also how the cone, which is meant to tell you watch out, also fits so perfectly into that shape. And so it becomes embedded in it. It becomes like, they're all really witty sculptural objects in the environment. So to me, this is him actually finding evidence of re-enchantment, of people like, these are like enchanted magic objects that are out there. And there's nothing remotely capitalist about it one way or the other. It's just like things being reused or newly used. It's outside of a capitalist system.
Yeah, very nice to bring this in as an example of this. Yeah, I did not consider that. I'm familiar with the guy's work, but it's indeed looking at the re-enchantment of objects that do not fulfill the purpose they were designed for. Very nice. I'm also going to make a small jump back and refer to Anne-Marie's comment in the chat. We talked earlier about pushing back against the ordinary or the common, and that in New York that was harder to do in the 70s perhaps than it was in Nice. And a good example that she indeed puts in the chat is of one of the situationists who was Algerian, Abdel Hafid Khatib, who did he supposedly did a psychogeographic study of Les Halles in Paris, but was constantly a number of times arrested because of limitations that were enforced on Algerians in Paris at the time. There was a curfew. Well, he was just seen as suspicious because he was Algerian. That was already enough to push against the norm. But then also he walked around at night, which was even more so pushing against the norm. Yeah, thanks. Okay. If you have more examples, I'm keen on hearing them. But I'm going to jump to a next question. That's a link on Abdel Hafid. That is, I'm going to jump to more to Fluxus, and specifically to Constant, one of the Fluxus artists, who I believe, if I remember correctly, also was involved in Cobra. But I might be wrong. I'm looking at you.
So Constant was a situationist.
Okay.
He was
okay.
involved in
not...
Cobra. You know this. You're just mixing it up. Constant was
okay.
a situationist architect.
Right. Yes.
Yes.
But he was involved in Cobra, right? Okay. So that's indeed what I was wondering. What I wasn't sure. But he's known. Well, he's known for a few things, but specifically for. Oh yeah, of course he was a situationist. Yeah, that's stupid. But he's known for one of the things that he's known for is this design or this idea of the city which he called New Babylon. And as you rightfully pointed out earlier in a previous conversation we had New Babylon. New Babylon's first name was Dérive, the city for the Dérives, but it became known as New Babylon, in which, and I think these are his words, inhabitants, because of increased automation, would have little work to do and lots of leisure time to creatively fill. Now, to me, this sounds a little bit like the ideas of today's tech bros who believe that we can all live in a utopia, ignoring the fact that the actual work is done in the literal periphery, the hard work is, or like for the for OpenAI and ChatGPT, the hard work is done in Kenya and Bangladesh. That's where they suffered, or for Facebook or Google, that's where they suffer through having to look at all the child pornography and whatnot. That then allows us to be free from these images, giving us the impression that we can live a perfect life. I think, to me, it sounds like in a similar way as to how Constant thought that the New Babylon was the utopian city where everyone could just play, not acknowledging that work needed to be done to allow everyone to play. So do you think that Constant was ignoring this work that had to be done to facilitate his city, or did he not realize that his vision was a true utopia and that it could not be achieved?
Okay, I'm going to pull up an image. All right, so this is New Babylon, Paris. And there's a bunch of these maps that he did of different cities where he superimposed New Babylon on top of them, right? The red structures, which you could imagine maybe up on stilts or something. So I don't think he was in denial about what it takes to keep life running. And I don't think he, I think he was being a visionary architect. And you have to take it in that way. Like, visionary architecture is not proposed as a real thing one should build. It's an idea. And it's a crazy idea. It's always crazy ideas, and it's unbuildable. And then I think the hope is that some of that trickles down into actually buildable structures and slightly different ways of living. And that's why I like this map, because this map is not suggesting we knock down all of Paris and build a new city, right? It's suggesting that, like, no, we kind of need the whole city where everybody lives and works and does whatever, but we also need more. We need other. So, like, what if it's, sort of plunked down and it's above, and we recognize that we need other spaces and other time in life in which to, dérive, let's say, or any number of other ways one might play in everyday life. I think it's a provocation, one that he worked on for decades, but I don't think it's ever been meant as a literal proposal.
Right. Yeah, that would make sense. But didn't he also push back specifically against Le Corbusier, or do I misremember this?
I don't remember.
Okay.
Probably. I mean, but one way to think about that, regardless of whether it was specifically Corbu or not, is Corbu and other modernist architects of the time proposed these mega projects, right? And so there is a little bit of an irony about Constant proposing a mega project, right, in order to do this avant-garde, totally other way of living, when they specifically do not believe in the mega projects being proposed that are going to ruin everyday life in the most arrogant way possible. So that's also why I don't take it seriously as a real proposal, but I take it seriously as a visionary provocation. Yeah,
I can totally see that. Also, if you look at his designs, if I remember correctly, there's no space that he designs for people to live. It's only space for people to sleep. There's only space for people to be active in the city. It's all ladders and walls and curves and whatnot. So it's more like a huge playground maybe than anything else. I'm reminded of, I think it was Le Corbusier who designed, or on whose ideas were designed, the Bijlmer in Amsterdam. It's all those series of huge apartment buildings that were built without then any shops and no transport. So people were stuck in these places, and they had to tear down a few of these apartment buildings to make the space more livable in the end. And I'm also reminded of Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, which was designed by now I forget the city planner's name, but Oscar Niemeyer was of course the architect, and Burle Marx was the landscape designer, but I forget the name of the city planner, which was designed as a city for cars. And the architecture is fantastic, but the city is horrible. It's not accessible at all. To push back against that, I totally can appreciate. Thanks. Maybe we can go to Anne-Marie's question in the chat. Anne-Marie, do you want to ask the question directly?
Hold on, I'll just
Oh, sorry, I say Anne-Marie, but I mean Alexandra. Sorry, Anne-Marie.
Okay, yeah, I'd already asked mine. Well, it was more a comment, really, anyway.
yeah, exactly. No, sorry, Anne-Marie. I mean Alexandra. Both started with an A. I'm very bad at reading. And I see Hamish has a question too. Alexandra, go for it if you want.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So yeah, when I went to New York after graduating university, encountered by chance, but maybe not, a young or small psychogeographic movement, people interested in those ideas. And I didn't maintain my connection with them, but I always had that in the back of my mind. And then in recent years, when I got it more deeply into, became a walking artist myself, essentially, I've always had the intention, I'll go back and reconnect. It's New York City. I'm sure there's a lot happening, tons happening with walking art. There must be tons of groups, walking art groups there. But in the last 2 years, when I have had a chance to go back and I've tried to find them, I've hardly found anything. And in fact, even more than that, the groups that I found that you would think would be connected with walking art and, have a sort of urban geography kind of mission. They don't even really know what walking art is, and the psychogeography as well. Now, I know there are a few exceptions. There are a few individuals who are connected with Walk, Listen, Create, who live in New York, etc. But on the whole, you see, for example, just this last winter, I went to the Shifting Landscapes exhibit at the Whitney, not one walking art piece, right? And this is, the last 20 years in the same time frame, walking art and psychogeography have bloomed enormously, not just in Western Europe, but around the world. I'm like, what happened? What happened to New York? I mean, there used to be, Fluxus was there. Psychogeographers were there to an extent. What do you think?
So there you have it. So Lori, what happened to New York? What happened to New York?
Well, I don't live there anymore, so I guess that's what happened.
Well, there you have it, Alexandra.
That's about the time I left, actually. Oh, I mean, I could offer some hypotheses. One is that New York has just become an increasingly impossible place for anyone experimental to live in. So people who have time that they want to spend in experimental ways might not be there anymore.
Yeah, but the same could be argued about London, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe not as bad, and New York has its peripheries, right?
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
We're not as good at forming groups in this country. Like groups that do not have a capitalist core, that do not have the funding that doesn't exist. Like, I don't know if it's an American problem or if it's a New York problem. This is not a great walking country.
Right.
Period.
Yeah, I totally. I mean, I think that is there at the root of things. But you always think of a city like New York because it is a walking city, and more or less has a decent public transportation system as defying that, right? And which is also why, I mean, I understand, I live in New Mexico. As far as I know, I have like one walking artist colleague out here. I'm trying to maybe nurture a few more, but not in a psychogeography context. It'd be like a urban, rural kind of context. But I've just been so surprised. At first I thought it was me. I just can't find them. They're hiding or something. But since I've tried over a number of years, and even the people who live there, who some of you know personally, so say, yeah, we agree with you. You're not finding them. They're not just, there's only a few of us leftovers here and nothing's happening and no one's supporting us. And more than that, the young artists living here have no clue about what walking art is.
Everyone I know who is a walking artist in the US is independent. They're not part of any kind of a group. They have some kind of idiosyncratic practice. So it's just not even pertinent to what you're talking about. It's a different thing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, I'll have to think about that. So thank you.
I think what you were mentioning earlier also, Lori, and what we also briefly talked about is that I think a lot of, also today, but historically as well, that a lot of the artists who use walking as a part of their practice the practice is almost by design, well, it's not necessarily anti-capitalist, but not capitalist. And it's harder and harder to gather around something that is further and further removed from the core of our economic system. I mean, our societies are becoming more and more capitalist, and then not moving up with that or moving with that capitalist streak means you by design are being shifted to the periphery more and more. So maybe that's part of the problem why you don't see them so much, Alexandra. Hamish also has a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, Lori, it's such a pleasure to actually get to meet you. I read your book from cover to cover, but no, that's not true. Actually, I had a lot of trouble actually getting hold of your book because the reason why
$1,600 on Amazon.
Oh, it was just so hard. And I'm working here in Australia, and I was finishing a PhD, and I think I had like about 10 quotes that I wanted to kind of get, but it was all from Jerome, who was writing an article on your book, but to actually get hold of your book was completely impossible for me. I couldn't do it, and I had to go through this very sort of cryptic way of getting an online document of your book and then looking for the page numbers. It was a pain in the ass.
I'm sorry. I hope that sort of thing is going to be solved now that the ebook exists.
Right. Oh, that's great to hear.
Because that's fairly recent, no?
The ebook maybe came out 2 years ago.
Yeah.
I was unable to get hold of the ebook. I tried to get hold of the ebook, and in Australia, I just didn't. I think I even, kind of was in dialogue with one of the major publishers, and they said, sorry, you can't do it. So I think there was a bit of an issue here in Australia. I can't remember what it was. But I just want to say, look, it's more a comment than a question, and it's just that it's really lovely to hear you and Babak talking. There's a lovely energy, I think, that's here, and I'm sort of coming slightly from a different place in that Walk, Listen, Create, the organisation that Babak's involved in, they have a kind of few strings to their bow, and one of them is sort of the audio walk. That's very much the direction that I've sort of come from, and particularly with locative media technology. So I'm kind of coming from a different place, but I have to say, reading your book was one of those kind of rare moments where I actually felt very inspired by the sort of the I wouldn't say philosophy, because I'm constantly struggling with psychogeography, the situationists, the surrealists, as to what's going on. To me, sometimes it comes across as this great big folly, a very pompous and slightly sort of overinflated sense of sort of artistic practice and performative stuff. But I love the works that you're kind of mentioning, and it really sort of draws me in. I feel much more inspired. And it's like the conversation that's happening, I think, with you and Babak, for me, sort of also reflects that it's very pitch perfect for Walk, Listen, Create to be talking to people like you. And one of the lovely things I think about you being in this conversation today is also that you're not actually sort of putting yourself forward as an artist. Everyone's an artist. You've got this kind of huge inventory of sort of experience and ideas and you're bringing that. You sort of bring that to the fore, and it's a delight. It's just a delight to kind of hear this conversation, and thank you very much. Yeah, that's all I really wanted to say.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Amish. And you're bringing up of coming from an angle that relates to audio and sound walks. My next question to Lori was exactly going to be about that. So perfect timing. I didn't even have to slip you money on the side to come in at this right moment. Thank you. And the question that I indeed wanted to ask Lori around this is related to Fluxus. Which a guy called Dick Higgins, doesn't really matter, defined 9 criteria for Fluxus art or Fluxworks in 1982, to which Ken Friedman added 3 more, another guy, doesn't really matter, in 1989. So there were 12 criteria that these guys identified that made art Fluxus art, and I'm going to mention them to you. They are globalism, unity of art and life, intermedia, experimentalism, chance, playfulness, simplicity, implicativeness, exemplativism, specificity, present in time, and musicality. And particularly, well, Lori, you say Masiunas. I thought it was Maciunas, but I'm wrong. It's Masiunas?
Maciunas, like ch.
Maciunas. Okay. Okay, Maciunas.
But you know what? I don't speak Lithuanian, so I have been known to mispronounce things. Maybe don't quote me. Okay,
I won't quote you. So this guy from Lithuania, who was like the godfather of Fluxus, very much looked to John Cage as inspiration for a lot of the work that Fluxus, or how he saw Fluxus really. And John Cage was, well, I mean, yeah, what is anyone anyway, but a musician or a sound artist. And the 12 things that I just mentioned, particularly ending with musicality, really, I think, moves Fluxus, at least in part, into the concept of sound walking, or using audio as a part of the experience when exploring public space. How do you see this, Lori? You got some ideas on this?
Okay. So one thing to say is I think it depends what kind of sound walks we're talking about. and I'm no expert in sound art and sound walking art, but for me, there's maybe two useful categories to think about here, and one I'm going to call the foraged sound walk, and one is the theatrical sound walk. And actually, I think they both track to this little history that you're suggesting of like Cage to Fluxus to now. So the foraged, hang on. There's my guy, Willem de Ridder. You mentioned him before, but he's our great Fluxus soundwalk artist. And I'm gonna put him at the head of the theatrical category. So he kind of invents the sound art, the theatrical sound art walk, right? In 1973, he does the first audio guided artwork, and he's using radio. He's using whatever technology he can at the time. But what he's really interested in is like, it's like so beyond breaking the fourth wall in theater. He wants to use the world as a stage, and he wants the participant to be like the actor, and he's going to use audio to sort of script the world. He calls them radio dramas, and you could like borrow a cassette or you could listen on the radio depending on the particular piece. And it's you know, some of it's depending on like finding out in the world, which you can't control, but he's using he's producing the audio as a way of like moving you through space and giving you a theatrical and narrative framework for it. And then the foraging kind is like, we can look to a fundamental piece like Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, right? Where you open the piano up, all the sound that happens in the room is the sound of the piece. You close the piano, you leave the stage. So foraged sound, like sound that is found in. And I think if you look at like sound art, walking art as I know it today, often falls into one or the other of these categories or some combination of them, where like you're going out in the world and you are finding the sounds, recording them, and you do something with them, or something that's a little bit more like, let's say, Janet Cardiff, where it's the theatrical version of that. So some of it is the found sound, but a lot of it is added in and tightly edited, and then we put you back out in the world to follow it. It's very much in the de Ridder line. But I think Cage is a great route to point to for all of this, because Cage was a forager. Like Cage was a great
literally
forager of mushrooms and sound, and he taught that. And all these Fluxus guys took his experimental composition class and his mushroom identification class at the New School in New York back in the day. And then they go on and they produce work that uses this approach to life, like being really aware and open to all kinds of sounds and being interested in finding things and being out in the world.
Yeah, thank you. And we're slowly running to the end of this lovely chat. Maybe we should keep going for another few hours if everyone is okay with this, or no, maybe not. But so I want to circle back to something I think we mentioned, or you mentioned at the very start, and that is that when you started writing your PhD, what you initially wanted was to talk about walking art today, or the successors of these three movements, but your PhD advisor or guide or whatever the word for this is, no, it has to be about historical research. And so one thing that I also was wondering, although I'm aware of more recent work, I mean, I'm one of the founders of Walkers and Create, obviously I'm aware of more recent work in the field of walking art, but I'm not aware, I think, of actual movements that have taken on the baton from these three movements that you highlight in your book. Have you got, I know you do mention one in your book, and I'm sure you're going to mention it now, but can you shed a light on this? What have you found in terms of movement, perhaps, that have taken on the baton of using walking or walking art as an integral part of their practice?
Do I mention an actual movement in the book?
Yeah, you do. Parkour.
Oh, sure. Like a non-art movement. Because my answer to if we're going to stick, with like professional art making, no, there aren't movements because we're just not in a time of movements. We're in a time of artists working independently, and sometimes they come together for a show or for like collaborative projects. There's collectives. We have collectives, but we don't have movements, and they're not the same thing. So if I were to talk, the only way for me to give you examples that answer your question is to push the movement aspect of it aside. And there's a lot of artists making work today that I think is, they are very much the inheritors of these movements, right? One or the other. But they are not themselves part of a movement. And I have not studied what that means, but there have to be some scholars who've been looking at this, who are trying to figure out what are the reasons why we do not have art movements per se today in a way that we did in the past.
Yeah, if anyone has an idea, if anyone has the answer to this question, I would also like to know it. But yeah, I take your point. Yeah. Maybe we're too individualistic.
I mean, one possible answer is to look at the way that the professional art world works and how it only really functions in terms of individuals, or occasionally a collective, which is treated like an individual, right? And so if you are playing that game, the game of trying to make a living and make work as a professional artist, then you have to some extent, be the cube, like fit the cube. Like that is how the system is set up currently. And it's a big, intense system. So that system did not exist during the time of the movements that I talk about in the book. It did not. That is a 1980s moving forward system.
Yeah. I'm reminded of
at the same time, cities have become increasingly prohibitive and expensive, and there's a huge crisis of accommodation, and the places like Paris and New York that artists used to reside, they're just not cheap, available places anymore.
I'm reminded of, I grew up in the Netherlands, and what was huge in the Netherlands in the 60s, 70s, less so 80s, was the squatter movement. And then in the 80s, 90s, you had these anti-squatter projects where those places that ran the risk of being squatted were being rented out at very low rates to anyone who wanted to rent them. But that precluded the possibility for these to be squatted, right? Because then you would occupy an actual space that was somebody's house, which was, I think, kind of the start of making it much more difficult to live at virtually no cost in the centers of culture, if you will. It has become prohibitively expensive to be a walking artist in New York, or to be a walking artist in Paris, or to be someone who does not participate in the capitalist process. And there is not that much money in walking art, so maybe that is part of that. Right, thanks. Now, thanks, and I'm sorry to hear that is the answer to that question. So we have parkour, right? Parkour. Now, one thing that you mentioned in an earlier discussion that we had is that you're a very happy cyclist, but that there are not many examples of good bicycle art. But there are a few. And so, give us some examples of good bicycle art if you have them.
We're going to end with bicycle art. I like that. Okay. I forgot to look this up, so I'm not going to actually remember all the artist names. I'm going to just have to describe it. But of course, there's Picasso's classic sculpture that has the bicycle bars in it. Okay. There's the wheel, Picasso's, Duchamp's wheel. It's a bike wheel, right? And then much, much more recently, there are two really hilarious Israeli sculptors. One is Mika Rottenberg. And she has a piece that involves a stationary bicycle, and the video, her work is very much about like the really grotesque assembly line aspects of contemporary culture and excess. And she has a piece involving a bicycle, and it's a video, and you watch it, and then it's shown on a bike that is turned into a sculpture. And you really get the feeling of like someone being on the bike and like they can't ever get off of it, and it's producing itself basically. It's a very depressing piece. And there's another Israeli artist, a man whose name I'm not going to remember, much more lighthearted artist, who showed something in one of the Sculpture Project Munster exhibits where in order to watch the video he had produced, you had to sit on a stationary bicycle and pedal it.
Nice.
And then it would generate the video that you were watching, which I believe also had to do with bicycling, but I can't remember it well. That's it. I don't know of any other bike art.
It's not a lot. The last piece reminds me of a piece from someone within our network. He's Italian but lives in the UK. He is doing or was doing a PhD. I think his first name is Andrea, but now I'm not totally sure. But he walked from his home in the UK to his home in Italy somewhere, and he was carrying a camera on a stick, 360 camera most of the time. And the piece that he made out of this was you had a cross trainer in a gallery, and the cross trainer powered the video that was of him walking. So you had to cross train to see what he saw with his camera. So that's a bit similar, although it was not cycling, it was cross training. Cross trainer art, there must be even less of that than bicycle art. I'm also reminded in terms of bicycle art, there's a few people who draw on maps by walking particular routes, right? They create figures and illustrations. And recently there was this guy who did, 1,000 morning runs, and with that made a video of a person walking by running a different route every day, and he could play them after each other. And it was an image of a guy walking on the map. But there are some people who do this with bikes. So they bike routes and then track them in Strava or something, and then make landscape art, if you will. So there's that, also bicycle art. Thank you. I think that sort of like is a nice thing to wrap up with. Is there something, Lori, that I should have asked that I didn't, or that you really think should be mentioned?
Oh, well, there was one question we didn't get to that I was excited about, which was about play.
Ah, yes, indeed. Well, that's sort of like, very good. Okay, so that sort of like fits, I think, into the question on walking art today. But indeed, specifically for the situationists, I think, who heard back to Johan Huizinga's Homo Ludens, where and the inspiration of play as a way to explore and understand the city. My question around this, I think, was whether you see this spirit actualized today. So do you?
Well, if we have time, yeah, because it's actually some of my favorite work.
Then we have time.
Okay, and maybe actually this makes me very happy to end on, because it's sort of depressing to end on the idea of like there's no more movements, everybody's an individual, it's all capitalist, and it's that's the only way that we make work today. But there's many artists who I think really have taken up the mantle, the play in everyday life mantle of the situationist, whether they acknowledge that dissent or not, it doesn't matter to me. And I'll just show you a few of them. So one is Leopold Kessler, who I believe is based in Vienna, and he's very much an interventionist. A lot of these artists are what I would call interventionists. So they usually sometimes with permission, sometimes not with permission, do things in the urban landscape. So one thing Leo Kessler has done, he's done many, is he alters a lot of street furniture to make the city a little bit more exciting to be in for pedestrians. So he's not the walker, we're the walkers. And he's done things like, for example, in Privatized, he hacked into all of the lighting, the outdoor lighting on a street in Paris, so that you could turn it on and off at will. And he gave the people who lived on the street the clickers.
Mm-hmm.
And there is this situationist idea of like, and surrealist, like it's more exciting to walk at night. And when you light the whole city up, you take away some of that excitement, that play. So there's that. And also like a little bit of, you know, ownership over the public spaces in your
Who
city.
owns the public
Collective.
space? I know.
So there's tons of examples by him that you can find on his website. And then there's a British artist named Aaron Williamson who did this hilarious piece called Barrier Man during a Fluxus festival, actually in Liverpool, that was organized by the Tate Liverpool. So for the duration of the festival, that's him in the yellow worker vest. And he just went around the city wreaking havoc by putting up barriers and like barrier tape and barrier cones that made no sense. And everybody followed them, except like one old lady in the video who's just like, whatever, and walks past the barrier because it's in her way. People ask him directions. He gives them the wrong directions to get everywhere because he looks official, which is brilliant. And it's something that Leo Kessler also does. Why he doesn't get in trouble when he hacks into public structures is he gets the uniform.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and people just let you do your thing, move furniture around, like take the trash can and put it 10 feet up a pole. So it's people understanding how the city's supposed to work and messing with that in fairly gentle ways that are playful for the rest of us, whether we know or not, and for them.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm immediately, hold on, I'm going to let you finish though, because I want to see more of these, but I'm reminded of two things. And I'm not totally sure if it was Kessler or another German artist, but it reminds me of Kessler. There was 3 or 4 years ago, this guy who bought like 150 old Android phones and put them in a little cart to stroll through Berlin with. And because all of them were turned on and used Google Maps or had Google Maps installed, it made Google think that that street where he was walking with his 100 or so Android phones was packed with traffic. So by doing so, he diverted all traffic in Berlin to avoid that particular street, just by walking with this little cart on an empty street with all these Android phones. And I'm also reminded of, there's a few videos on YouTube or wherever, which are videos of two guys who get into everything because they carry stairs. So they're carrying stairs, and then they go into cinemas and museums, and just because they are carrying stairs, people think, oh, they're official people. They need to do some work inside. Of course, they can get in. So yeah, reminded of these two things. Go on. Sorry.
Totally. And those two guys are not artists, which is maybe my favorite part of them. They just do it.
Yeah. And I'm reminded actually of another one that I don't think it's these two guys. It's two guys also who dressed up a mannequin and then put a little money box in front of the mannequin, like on a square, say somewhere in Rome or whatever, pretending that the mannequin is one of those people that don't move, right? And so the mannequin is standing there, dressed up, not moving. There's a little bucket for money, and people throw money in there. And so at the end of the day, that's what these videos are. They're drinking beer from the money that the mannequin made for them on the streets. It's hilarious. Anyway, sorry.
Okay, so there's the example of the city of Tirana, Albania, which had a painter mayor for a couple of years there. He's still in politics. I think he's the head of the country. And very much in the situationist idea of like decor matters, repainted this horribly dull, gray, post-Stalinist city like this.
Yep.
And it's very controversial, but it's wild. It's maybe the most expansive seeing through of some of these situationist ideas that I've ever come across. Like he did a city.
Yep.
It's wild. What else? Let's skip that one. Alex Vilar. So this is very nice because parkour is hard to do. Like most people should not do parkour. They will get very badly hurt. All I can do, I watch the videos, but like I can't do it. But Alex Villar, who is a Brazilian artist who's been in New York for many years, he does it in a way that's very accessible and that is very, very aware of the rules of urban space and how you can gently break them really without getting in any trouble. Like it's very gentle parkour. And then he shows them as videos. So you can see still images from some of these videos that he did about 20 years ago. So you can see how he's like finding space that we don't even think exists, like the space between, right, the guardrail and the wall, or the space between like where two walls meet. Or he'll walk in between the space of the parked car and the curb, that tiny little space that's not really there. Or he has one video where he's really interested, it's called Upward Mobility. And so he's just climbing every structure he can find in a city. You know, and like he's working really, really hard. And for a normal person, he's quite capable, but it's not parkour level. It doesn't have the virtuosity and the danger of parkour, but it still has this, the view that parkour encourages of the city structure, which is like the city is your playground. There are other ways to do things and other spaces to move in.
Yeah, it's a good example of taking back public space. And there's not enough of that in our lives. Yeah, we as individuals need to understand that public space is our space, not the space that is administered by someone else. It's public. Yeah.
And I think children often understand this very well because they haven't been taught to think otherwise. But if you walk around with kids who are young enough, like this is how they move. They're like, ooh, a ledge, I'll go on the ledge.
Yeah.
Right? So sometimes I think that's a key too. Like there's radical political awareness, and then there's just like being playful like a child.
Yeah. Would you say that the Situationists were maybe more on the side of the political awareness, and the people from Fluxus were more on the side of play?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, me too.
And then we get Alex Villar, who's a little of both.
We get whom? Alex Villar. This
Alex
guy.
Villar.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know him, and you know, I'm not Brazilian, but I've been living in Brazil for a while. I'm also reminded of, which is not walking art, but what is very common here in Brazil is pichação, where graffiti, if you will, but it's a lot of the pichação are political commentary. So it's occupying the public space, right? And it's also what's also interesting with that is that quite a few cities in Brazil, not all, but Sao Paulo is one of them, there is no outdoor advertising in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. So there are no billboards. But it also means, first of all, that there's lots of empty spaces on the sides of buildings, but many of those, there's literally hundreds of 30, 40, 50 meter tall paintings on the sides of buildings now to replace public advertising. But also those spaces that have not been occupied by or have not been covered in large murals are occupied by pichação, texts that have been written on these walls by people who sort of like upsile with ropes from the sides of buildings or climb on top of them and sometimes fall and die. But it's a lot of it. A lot of it is public or political commentary. Yeah. Anyway, do you have more?
Yeah. One more slide. So these are two examples of artists who are being creative with the surveillance systems that exist now that order so much of our life and our understanding of urban space. So Jill Magid did this piece, I think also in Liverpool in 2004. There's many parts to it, but the one that interests me specifically is where she's moving through the city. She's the woman in the red jacket, and she has an earpiece in, and her eyes are shut, and she's being guided by a policeman inside the CCTV center, like who's watching her through all of these cameras that are everywhere in the city, right? Which Liverpool has, I think, more than anywhere, or did at this point. more cameras surveilling public space. So Jill is someone who is very, very good at embedding in a very human way into systems that seem unbreachable. And that's what she did here. She talked the police into doing this with her. When you watch the video, you hear the voice of the policeman who's in her ear. He sounds lovely. He's like being really gentle with her and trying to keep her safe. It is the opposite of how I think about those systems. And I don't think she's suggesting that they're gentle systems, but she's interested in finding the chinks in the system and where the humans are in the system and the other ways that we could work with the system. And there's a lot of surveillance camera art that exists beyond this. All different kind.
It's a bit disturbing to me that this piece of hers is from 2004, 21 years ago. And already apparently then the city was so completely blanketed in surveillance cameras that this was possible then. It's disturbing. Yeah, we should head out. But I do want to bring to attention Alexandra's comment that is not new. Lots of people have noticed this at one point or the other. She says that about 90% of the artists that we're talking about are male. And this is indeed a common complaint about the Situationists as well. But also it's a common issue with walking or with occupying public space. There's always a risk associated with it, particularly if you do something that is not that doesn't follow established patterns. Do you want to say something about this, Lori?
That I agree.
Yeah. Okay. That was easy. But yeah, this is problematic. But it's also like reality. Yeah. What do you want to say something about this, Alexandra?
No, I mean I don't know enough about the movements to know whether there's a more hidden side of women working in them, that is less talked about, which after you scratch the surface often ends up being the case with a lot of movements. We found, the initial theory is that these were male-dominated movements. And then after research has been done, that theory is more or less disproven. The women were written out of history, right?
Yeah.
and
I think this is definitely
wasn't paid attention to. So I have no clue. I don't know enough about it to say if that's the case with these movements, and that have the women been written out, or were women for one reason or another at least earlier. I mean, I think there are many, many women artists now who adopt these ideas, maybe even more than men. But in at the time these movements were active as movements, what we know, as you say, with the situation is they were pretty sexist and kind of purposely keeping women out.
Yeah, and Deborah was supposed to be, was known to be a bit of a misogynist, right? So there's that. Though I believe that in Fluxus there were more women.
Hang on, I gotta put the lights back on in here.
Somebody intervened, Lori. Oh, that was easy. And of course, there's Yoko Ono as well, right? Well, one woman doesn't make a movement, a women's movement, but at least there's that. Yeah.
Another thing. Sorry to interrupt, but another thing I was thinking about, and because I've recently was doing a bit of research on Ana Mendieta, and then she's not a walking artist, but you start looking at her work through the lens of walking out. She's a contemporary of Richard Long, and you're like, the way they're approaching landscape, actually Richard Long should be put in the context of Ana Mendieta rather than Robert Smithson. Right?
Can you put her name in the chat? Because, I've been influenced by the male-dominated chauvinist pigs in our world, and I have no idea who you're talking about.
She's a hugely famous Cuban-American artist.
What?
Anyway, so if you look at Robert Long's work, most famous walking artist, whether he deserves to be or not, he is. In the context of her work, I find everything becomes much more interesting than, say, looking at his work in the context of, say, Robert Smithson. Right. And so I think that I wonder, I'm just speculating if some of that is at play. It's like Yoko Ono. Yes, she's Fluxus. She wasn't using walking, although she was using public space. Very interesting, like her cut piece originally was in a gallery space, but she did a version in Central Park, which I think is much less known, right? And so I wonder if like there's this kind of side angle to it that's less focused on the walking, but equally key to the concepts. And that's where a lot of the women were working. I don't know, but just thinking about Yoko Ono, thinking about Anna Mendieta, I wonder about that.
Yeah, I have no answer. Lori?
I might have some answers. So one thing is to point you toward a book called Flâneuse. If you are interested in, it's a book written quite recently, looking at specifically at women flaneurs in literature, in like cross-culturally. Because one of the answers about the surrealists is, of course, there's important women surrealists, and a number of them have been sort of refound over the years, but they're not the walking surrealists.
Right.
And the answer to why would be to look at what it meant to walk as a woman, like alone or in a group in Paris at that time, and you didn't walk like men. So
right.
Maybe if you wanted to, you dressed up like a man. And Flâneuse is interesting because there's some case studies of women in culture in Paris who were known to walk that way. Like they dressed as men, how they roamed around, because it gave you a certain freedom to move in a very, really important modern way that only men could do, and white men.
Right.
With Fluxus, actually there's tons of women in Fluxus, and Yoko Ono has lots of walking art.
Yeah.
So Fluxus is really different from a feminist angle than the Surrealists or the Situationists International.
Thank you. I think it's time to wrap up. One final question. When's your next book coming out, Lori?
Never. I don't know. When they go to college. I don't understand how people do the work it takes to write a book when they have small people around. And mine aren't even that small anymore. Like all I can do is look at exhibitions and write about them, which takes me like 2 days tops. And then I can move on to the next subject. I don't have to like keep thinking long and hard about something.
Have you got a 60-word a minute performance lined up?
Oh, the next one. No, I haven't done one since the fall. I don't know where the next one will be. Invite me somewhere.
Yeah, and also not done one since the fall. That's only like 3 months ago.
Yeah, but I like to do like one a season, but it doesn't always happen.
Right. Where was the one in the fall last year?
It was easy. It was in Chicago, but it was for a very particular population. So it was for homeless artists who work with this group called Red Line Service, and we did a collaboration, and I wrote reviews just for their artists.
That sounds really good. That sounds really fascinating. Nice. Thank you, Lori. It's been a really nice chat. One of my two cats is saying hi. Hello, everyone. Meow, 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 meow. Thank you very much, Lori. It was really a very pleasant, very insightful. Learned a lot. I hope you guys also enjoyed it in the room. And I recommend again for you to get Lori's book digitally, not off Amazon. And I'm gonna hope and see if I can get you, or I can at least get to your next 60 word a minute performance. Do you write 60 words a minute? Is that what you are able to do? You get there?
I mean, no, it's meant to indicate that there's a speed component to it.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much again. Yeah. And until next time, and thank you everyone for sticking around for almost 2 hours. I hope you enjoyed it. We've got, so with that, I want to wrap up. No, we got to the play. I already asked the question whether I missed out something, and then we talked for another 20 minutes. So I'm not going to do that again. So we've got a few things coming up, including tomorrow morning, if you're in Europe, at like 8 o'clock, I think. There's a cafe with Beach of Dreams, I believe, with Ali Petty, I believe. And then we've got a bunch of things, but you have to just look on the Walkless and Great website. There's a lot happening over the next few weeks. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye and thank you, Lori.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure. Bye, everyone.
Bye.